Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Beri Meric. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Matt Yglesias. Matt, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. I want to wish you a happy Friday and to everybody else also joining us from around the world. Today, we're going to be talking about 1 billion Americans, the case for thinking bigger. And Matt is a fantastic guy to take us on this journey towards thinking bigger. He's the co-founder of the extraordinary media empire, Vox, where he currently works as a senior correspondent covering politics and economic policy. He's also the host of the very popular podcast called The Weeds. Before launching Vox, he was writing the Money Box column for Slate and blogged for Think Progress, The Atlantic, TPM, and The American Prospect. He's the author of 3 books, including his most recent national bestseller called, again, The 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. Matt, I want to thank you again for being here. And I want to kick off by asking you, what led you to writing this book? What's so important when it comes to this concept of what you termed 1 billion Americans, and what's at stake here?
This is like really literally the dumbest origin story for a book, but I saw somebody on Twitter say, "Here's an idea, 1 billion Americans." And I just loved it. I loved it immediately. I didn't say like, okay, I've got to go write that book. But it was an idea that rattled around my head. And I started thinking about so many topics that I was covering as a journalist. And was covering problems of immigration policy. I was covering questions about the design and purpose of the welfare state. I was covering a president who got everybody to wear little red hats that say "Make America Great Again," but then never seemed to really have a lot of policy follow through on that. I was covering so many cities, more cities than people realize in the Midwest and the Northeast, that have lost population and that are struggling, and where each of them kind of has some promising ideas. You know, here's how Rochester's going to make a comeback. Here's how Cleveland's going to make a comeback. Here's how Detroit's going to make a comeback. But how are they all going to make a comeback? Right? How's that going to work? How are we going to combine the benefits of immigration and openness and the traditional strengths of America with the reality that people care about national identity, that people care about patriotism, that people care about the flag? And I started to see that it was like 1 billion Americans was this incredible idea that could bring together so many different things that I'm interested in, that could address so many different topics that I think people know are pressing, but that we never quite get around to dealing with because we're so busy with the kind of main axis of partisan conflict. And also that I knew political polarization is not going to get us anywhere. You know, I mean, the election that's happening right now, it's very important. People have donated a lot of money to it. A lot of people are voting. It's great to see people kind of fired up about it. But also, this style of politics is ultimately not going to take us anywhere as a country. We need some sense of purpose and things that bring us together. And that's ultimately where 1 billion Americans comes from, a desire to write a book that people who are more conservative than me could find something interesting in, things that some people on the left might find disagreeable, things that are interesting and important and relevant, but not exactly the same as the dialogue we're having every day.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you so much for that. So in a nutshell, what is the vision and promise behind what you term 1 billion Americans?
So the idea of 1 billion Americans, it's subtle, but it's that we should have 1 billion Americans. And so, so why, right? And the sort of, biggest, most obvious way to frame it is we see people talking more and more about international competition with the People's Republic of China. We see this is one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree about these days. When Trump and Biden were arguing at last night's debate, it was like, who's more on the take? Nobody was saying like, oh, and nobody in America says like, oh, it's fine. Like we'll just be number 2. We're going to let them keep developing, and they'll be the most important country in the world. Like we don't want that, for good practical reasons, and also just nationalism, pride. We want to win in the world. So how can we do that? And fundamentally, so much of the strength of the People's Republic just comes from its size, the enormous scale of the Chinese population. Uh, but then you look at the United States, right? Like why are we a big important country, right? And like Canada, which is nice. I like Canada. I've been there. Some of my best friends are Canadian, but like nobody cares what Canada does. And it's because like nobody lives there, right? Whereas the United States, the leaders of the early republic, the leaders of 19th century America, some of the leaders of 20th century America have made this a country that is populated by lots and lots of people. So we are a major power in the world, but we are now in a point of relative decline. And we can address that by being welcoming to more immigrants and doing more to support parents and people who are, growing our own children here at home, somewhat reverse the precipitous decline in the birth rate, somewhat reverse the precipitous decline in immigration that we've seen over the past 20 years, and get on track to tripling the population over the next generation or two, and we stay number one forever.
Thank you, Matt. So it's a fascinating vision. I'm sitting here. I'm not originally from the US, but I had the incredible opportunity to be here. I'm sitting in a city here, New York City, which a couple hundred years ago only had a few tens of thousands of people, and now we have millions of people. The whole country of the US, it wasn't 300 million people from the beginning. Why is this like such a unique idea, or why is this not something that's more widely talked about? What's getting in the way of a vision that's like quite literally saying, okay, we have just over 300 million people, China has over 1 billion. Doesn't it just make sense? And also people actually want to be here in the US, a lot of people from around the world. So what's the issue here, both from the left and the right? Like what's stopping this?
What's interesting is people do talk about it sometimes, and then I think they don't think about it, right? So while I was working on this, Mike Pompeo is Secretary of State. He's giving a speech somewhere. He's like in the Midwest somewhere for whatever reason. But he's talking about the US and China. And he says, I'm not someone who believes that decline is inevitable. There's a reason that people from all over the world want to move to the United States, and they don't want to move to China. And like America's amazing. Our system is amazing. And I'm reading it, I'm like, you're so correct, Mike. So like what's up with Donald Trump? Like, like he's working in the Trump administration, which doesn't seem to think that at all. But like that's what he said, right? But so why aren't we taking advantage of the fact that people would like to move here? Why are they promoting this discourse about immigration that's so suspicious, right? That's so almost paranoid about the idea that like, well, one bad guy is going to slip through somehow. And some of it's just politics, it's like they're trying to win. Republicans have this tax program that I think they know people don't like. So they have to come up with other kinds of things to argue and fight about. There's some elements of racial bias and just kind of cultural prejudice out there that are holding them back. And then on the Democratic side, people on the left in America have developed this very schizophrenic attitude toward patriotism, where if you see a Joe Biden or Kamala Harris event, it's like they're up there on the stage with the little flags and they say like, this is not what America is, when they want to say Trump is doing something bad, and like they love the country and it means a lot to them. But intellectuals on the left, I think a lot really don't feel that way, right? And they're like, well, okay, that's okay for the chumps out there on the campaign trail, but like behind closed doors, we don't take that kind of thing seriously. And it means that the people who do the ideas work, who think about policy, they don't want to, they're uncomfortable framing their ideas in terms of the nation and what does it amount to as America, right? Even though they know these ideas are potent on some level, they don't want to espouse them. And it's a very, I think it's like a political dead end for the left, just on a level of values. While on the right, I think they've suffered from a lot of intellectual ossification over there. They want everything to be, Ronald Reagan, mid 1980s, forever and ever. But the world changes and situations change, and they need to learn to sort of adapt with the times a little better.
Thank you, Matt. So interesting, the way that, there doesn't seem to be like major political support on either side for like just pushing for more immigration and building out, the country further. Share with us, why, what you see as like the current problem that we're facing. In your book, you've dedicated 3 chapters to this. Share with us what you think is the challenge.
No, I think it's underappreciated in the United States, just factually. I'll say like triple the population, and people say, "Oh my God, like we're all going to be in, cesspools of whatever." The United States is an incredibly sparsely populated country still. After hundreds of years of settlement. If we had 1 billion Americans, it sounds like a lot, right? It's a big number by design. I don't want to lie about that, but we would be talking about having the population density of France, about half the population density of Germany, a much lower population density than Italy or Switzerland, the United Kingdom, lots of nice European countries, to say nothing of the developed Asian countries. And it actually harms us in a modern services economy. It means that a lot of our people are living in places that don't support modern broadband infrastructure, for example, that don't support modern healthcare systems, where even though population is still there in small town areas, the working age population is shrinking. So there's no business investment there. We have big cities, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, Baltimore, Philadelphia, that are way below their historic peak populations. And then we have this incredible tail of smaller cities, Hartford, Utica, Binghamton, Rochester, Toledo, Akron, that are like that, right? Little, cities that are usually built around factories or waterways that have become a little historically irrelevant, that are losing people, but where we have this tremendous amount of both physical capital and sort of intangible social capital, but it can't be mobilized effectively. And in a lot of cases, it's literally wasting away. Like you see houses becoming vacant, becoming abandoned, getting torn down. You see, and when we see restoration of those things, right? I mean, whenever we drive through a downtown and we see the old warehouses have been turned into, I don't know, like CrossFit studios and condos, and there's a Whole Foods. It's like, we know that that's good, right? But that doesn't happen if every place is depopulating simultaneously. There's no way to address it on an economic level. And then we're facing these unprecedented international challenges that we are kind of talking about, but not addressing in any kind of really real way. And then we're convincing ourselves that we just can't fix certain things, So people will say, well, there's going to be more traffic jams if you do that. Which, like, I guess is true. Then the book, I love transportation policy, so I discuss in some detail ways you can improve that. But at a certain level, you got to be like, this is the United States of America. Like people went in like little rinky-dink carts with oxes to like walk to Oregon from St. Louis, and now we're going to say, well, we can't grow anymore because we're afraid of a traffic jam. Like we might need another bridge somewhere. We might have to paint a bus lane. Like, can't we do things? And I think this pandemic, it's just such a moment of national paralysis, and it's really sad. And it shows that we need to get energized, as a people, but as a culture, right? To the idea that like we should be able to move fast, we should be able to make changes, we should be able to accept some dislocation in order to address big fundamental problems instead of continuing to sort of drift complacently.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. And the other, so there's obviously this one key issue of like what you're sharing, I think stats that are not often heard, which is like how underpopulated the US is compared to many other industrialized nations in relation to its landmass. You also talk about this, the dismal economics of child rearing as another one of the problems. Could you share with us a little overview of what you mean by that.
Yeah, so this is another thing I think a lot of people don't know. I think most people are aware, maybe aware, that the number of children people have in the United States has been declining. And I think the most natural thing to think is that, well, people don't want children anymore. Right. And so they'll do takes and I'll be like, well, I talked to my millennial friend and she said, blah, 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 blah. But the General Social Survey actually asks people, how many children would you like to have? And that number has stayed very steady at around 2.5 per woman. Men answer a little bit less, more like 2.4, but who cares? I mean, nobody cares what men think about family life. So what has changed? And it's that the gap between the number of children that people actually have and the number of children that women say they want to have keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can also look at surveys and, they ask people, it's like, why? Why don't you have as many children as you would ideally like to have? And it's childcare costs too much. I can't afford it. It took me too long to achieve financial stability and now I'm too old. It's like, it's money stuff, right? And then you look at it, you go look at what has changed in the United States since 1980. And people are going to school more. They're staying in school longer. The cost of that has gone up. The cost of childcare for little kids has gone up even faster than that. And it's been offset by the fact that televisions are cheaper, a lot cheaper. Cell phone plans are a lot cheaper. Furniture is a little bit cheaper. Cars are a little bit cheaper. And so that's great, right? So we say like, okay, the GDP has grown. But it's an incredible shift in the relative costs, right? You can now, on an average American salary, afford a level of gadgetry that, if you took that to the late 1980s, people would say like, you're like a magician, right? Like your smartphone, your Netflix, your Spotify, and very normal middle-class people can easily afford all that stuff. But things that people in the 70s would have taken for granted, that like you could get a house that fits 3 children in it and you could, have the children taken care of and maybe one of them would go to college and it wouldn't cost that much. They could do, part-time jobs over the summer and pay for it. Like that's gone, right? Like raising children has become incredibly expensive. So people don't do as much of it as they used to. And there's a libertarian strain in policy that like treats children as the equivalent of like exotic pets, right? And so it's like, well, if it's become expensive to have like a strange lizard in your house, but cheap to watch Netflix, who cares? But like, children aren't exotic pets, right? Like this is the future of our society. It's so important to people in an emotional sense, in a life fulfillment sense, and it's important to the country. If we think of, America as an enduring enterprise, it says right in the Constitution that we want to secure for ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty. And, America is a country that only really holds together if we take its ideas seriously. We're not an ethnic group. We're not a religious group. When we fall back on those kind of identities, we go to ugly places and big problems. And so we have to think of our society as, founded in principles, founded on ideals, and in a desire to see those ideals triumph over the longer haul. And that means like we need to care about family life and we need to care about our relative place in the world.
Excellent, Matt. So basically, on the one hand, the country has a lot more room to grow from a physical perspective. On the other hand, the economics of having lots more kids to make that happen is just like, it's not necessarily sensible for people. It's become very expensive. So with those two things in mind, if you could share with us your vision of this like 1 billion Americans, one, what then the country would look like if that was the case,
Mm-hmm.
and then how you would go about getting to that number. So I want you to really kick it off with like, again, how it would look like, and then the ways to get there, given the economics of what's involved.
Sure. So, America's big, right? 1 billion Americans would look like, you could ask yourself, well, what does America look like now? right? And America looks like all kinds of things. It looks like the Grand Canyon, and it looks like New York, and it looks like the suburbs of Cincinnati. And America would continue to be diverse in that sense, with lots of people living in rural areas and lots of people living in big cities. But compared to today, the places that are clearly urbanized, but that have shrunk, right? The St. Louis's and Toledo's of the world would be bigger than they are now. They would be bigger than they were historically, and they would be growing. People would be saying, look, these are urban centers with airports and infrastructure and cultural amenities, and where, unlike in some of our big coastal cities, it's cheap to live and to move and to start a business. So people would be doing that. And we would be looking at our big coastal cities, though, where we have stopped building housing. And we would say, we're going to go back to that, right? We would say, look, if the San Francisco Bay Area is going to be home to 3 of the world's 5 biggest companies, it can't be the second biggest city in California, right? Like it should be one of the biggest cities in the world. Um, and that's going to mean, yeah, like San Francisco looks more like Manhattan, but even more so, it's going to mean Silicon Valley is not going to look like a suburb out of the mid 1960s. It's going to look like it's the hub of economic innovation in the United States, and it's going to mean that Seattle becomes a great world city. Amazon's there, Microsoft's there. It's got to be more than like a fish market and old Frasier reruns. And these are things that we know how to do, like build some tall buildings downtown and some modest apartments hither and yon. It's like not beyond human capacity. It's just against the rules in so much of the country. And then the countryside, rural America is going to look a lot like it does, but it's going to have, the sort of comparative advantage of small towns is really children and families in so many ways. But if people aren't doing that, right, small town America has come to have this very elderly skewing age pyramid, right? They're almost like retirement communities in so much of the countryside. And it's going to look, more like it did a generation or two ago. Families with 3 kids or 4, maybe even there. And we're going to be more diverse, though. Like it's already baked into the cake that we're going to have a sort of acceleration of diversity, but that would go sort of supercharged, based on more immigrants, but also based on more native born people. Because if you look at the cohort of 20 somethings in the United States, that's a much more diverse group of people than the cohort of 60 somethings. And I just, like who has kids, right? I mean, we know. So these two things really work together in terms of driving that demographic transformation, and that's something that conservative minded people are going to have to live with, right? If they want America to be great again, it's going to be a forward looking vision of America. It's not going to look like America did in the past. And there's always been that tension in that slogan is, are you saying greatness, or are you talking about againness, right? Are you just talking about nostalgia? Because nobody achieves greatness through nostalgia, right? Neither on the left or on the right. And we're going to have to be a more forward looking kind of country.
Thank you, Matt, for painting the picture of what the US will look like when, if and when it undertakes this kind of an approach. Share with us now specifically about immigration. I'm assuming that you expect a lot of this population growth to come from people moving here. Tell us how you see that happening. What are the biggest obstacles to it, and how it could be overcome?
Well, I think we need to think a little bit more pragmatically about immigration than we do right now. Right now, the way Congress thinks is like there's a fixed pool of visas. So if anybody wants to say, well, we should have more visas for foreign-born entrepreneurs, then it's like, well, who's going to lose visas? And we'll say, all right, well, we're going to take visas away from I don't know what, from Philippines, and then people get all mad because, well, I don't want to take visas away from people in the Philippines, and then nothing happens, right? But there's no reason to look at it that way. different people can have different views about different categories of immigration. But if we can agree that it's good to have people with STEM skills come move here, then like let's just agree and make it easier for them to come, right? It's incredible. I mean, I take it you were born abroad yourself, so you probably know this, but the hoops you need to jump through for people in relatively uncontroversial categories of immigration are incredible. I really changed my thinking when Vox was new and we were hiring people, and we got a resume that was really good from a woman who was a Canadian journalist, and she was working in London, and she was applying to work for us, and I was like, all right, we're going to hire her. And then somebody from the general counsel's office was like, well, have you thought about the visas? And I was like, no, I hadn't thought about the visas, because I hear in politics, I mean, I cover politics, and you hear all the time about like, well, secure the border, and they're driving down wages for working class people, or they're bringing crime. Nobody cares if like 20 something Canadian journalists come and take our jobs. It's like, what's the issue even? But it's incredibly difficult, right, for skilled professionals to move here. And then it's become this partisan trope where Tom Cotton says, well, we should have a points-based system like they do in Australia, he says. But then he wants to cut legal immigration in half. But Australia has more immigration than we do. So we should like actually copy that system, not like fake copy it and then say, well, okay, so now we don't need to have any foreigners coming here. So visa allocation is very complicated. There's like a lot of details. My friend Dara will jump on my back if I say anything even slightly wrong about it. But I think we should look to younger people, educated people, maybe people with English language skills, who conservatives say we should be prioritizing, but then we should like really open the doors and not just use that as an excuse to like be stingy about refugee admittances. Because it's actually the more skilled people you have coming, the more you have work for refugees, right? The more you can sort of do both and do it all, and have a kind of real success driving forward.
And realistically speaking, Matt, how would this, if there's not any major appetite from either party to do this, could it ever really happen? Does it take one particular person to champion this and educate? Or do you think, it's a really nice idea, but if you had to bet on it, it's probably not going to happen?
Well, it's just everybody buys the book. It's just rockets to the bestseller lists, and then the politicians get going. I mean, there's no better way to solve big problems than to buy my book. But to be serious, this is a sleeping issue. So Gallup tracks every year. They say, should there be more immigrants, fewer immigrants, or should we keep it the same? And for the longest time, it's number one, fewer immigrants, but below 50%. And then people saying same immigrants, and then like tiny group of people saying we should have more immigrants. And so that's why we've had this immigration deadlock between fewer or same, right? Forever and ever and ever, 80s, 90s, 2000s. But it's slowly growing more immigrants, right? It goes from 2% to 3% to 4% to 5%. And then in the past 5 years, it's taken off like a rocket ship. And so more immigrants actually surpassed the same number of immigrants just last year. In last year's survey, for the first time ever, we're at a record of people saying we should have more immigrants. And nobody has championed that cause yet, because politics is a little bit of a lagging indicator, but it's there, right out there, right? Like there is a constituency even before everyone has read my incredibly convincing book, for increasing levels of immigration. And it's just an opportunity, right? I mean, I think we all know, I'll be very controversial. I think Biden is probably going to win the election. That's what the polls say. He's also quite old, as I think people have noticed. The long-term future of politics is probably not Joe Biden. And so people are going to be looking, like what's next? What's out there? What is their appetite for that is growing and is not being answered by the political system? And I do think more appreciation of the value of immigration is right there high on that list.
Could you just clarify that stat? The latest, you said it skyrocketed, and now people wanting more immigration has exceeded the number that wants the same. Do you recall the percentages there?
I could look it up, but I think it's about 30%. It's not that it's become the majority view exactly, but it's become the plurality view, right? Is we should have more immigration, and yet nobody in politics is pushing for it. We now have an argument between two stances that are less popular than we should have more.
All right, thank you, Matt. Share with us, obviously one obstacle is around this immigration. There are others who, for example, claim what would be the environmental impact of something like that? Having 3 times as many Americans who happen to also consume more than many other kinds of individuals out there. How do you grapple with that question?
So, there's two ways you can think about that, right? I mean, one thing is just to say that I don't think that, it's a bad thing if somebody comes here from Haiti and their living standards increase a lot. It's true that like there's more pollution, but also it if you did the opposite, if you were like, okay, everybody in Chicago is going to have the living standards of Haiti, we wouldn't be like, well, that's good. There's less pollution now, right? Like that would be an incredible tragedy. So I want us to take environmental issues more seriously as a country, right? I would like to see pricing on carbon dioxide pollution. I would like to see it made easier from a permitting perspective to solar projects, to do wind projects. I would like to see much more money poured into researching, for batteries, long-term storage. I think we need to make sure we're regulating methane emissions from fracking sites. I mean, I have a lot of like normal environmentalist opinions, but it's not like the be all and end all of the world, right? Like if the problem is just literally, okay, more human beings are going to exist because people can have happy families, or people can escape tragic levels of poverty and oppression in other countries in the world, like that's fine. Like that's just sort of the price you have to pay. Then it's worth saying, particularly from a climate perspective, that migration is adaptation in a really important way, right? That the costs of climate change are not geographically uniform. Somewhat warmer weather in Rochester, Minnesota is like not a catastrophe for humanity. The nature of the climate catastrophe is that people are living in the tropics, people are living in agricultural societies, people are living in low-lying coastal areas, people are living in places that are vulnerable to wildfires. And so to an extent, like we need to have less carbon dioxide emissions. We ideally need to have like incredible breakthroughs that let us get to true zero. But we also need people to be in places that are safe. And the United States is actually, along with Canada, like one of the great possible climate refuges of the world. And so we should not be pulling up the gates and saying we're doing it for environmental reasons.
All right, thank you for that, Matt. And switching from the environment now to housing, Tom Seaman here in our audience asked, with 1 billion, we'd lose a lot of our arable land to housing. And also you mentioned housing is very expensive now. It's difficult for people to find a place to raise 3 kids. Share with us your proposed solutions for how we could address that.
Yeah, I don't think it's true that there's a big trade-off between housing and agricultural output. The United States actually has been having shrinking farmland for decades now, but agricultural output keeps going up because we're becoming more productive. But also just like where people live and where agriculture happens tend to be fairly different places. The most, the biggest opportunity for housing is in, they say building up rather than building out, although there's actually a fair amount of out to the up, but is infill, right? Is you look at what is the existing footprint of human settlement in the United States, and it's fairly expansive, and it's in many places fairly expensive. But like I'm, living in Logan Circle neighborhood in Washington D.C. It's a nice neighborhood. It's very dense by U.S. standards, 3-story row houses connected to one another. but it's very expensive. It's very expensive to live here, and you're not allowed to build like an 8-story apartment building. You're not allowed to convert your garage into a small apartment that you rent out to somebody. And it's a kind of unique spot though, because from where I live, you can walk to downtown. We have a lot of good mass transit, and we should be building very, very, very densely right here where I live. And so to say everybody needs to come move to this neighborhood. Like, people are going to live in the suburbs, people are going to live in small towns. Like, that's all fine. But you can tell from the prices that there is incredible levels of demand for more housing in the urbanized parts of DC, Boston, New York, Bay Area, West Side Los Angeles, every place around Seattle, Portland, a lot of our college towns, even like Austin has now, it grew very rapidly there because it was cheaper than the big coastal cities and it was cool. But now it's not cheap anymore. And, we can build a lot within our existing footprints, probably still having some expansion, but I don't think we should envision tripling the sort of footprint of the built environment. We should envision places looking denser.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. What about just when you think through all the other kind of opportunities that you see when it comes to growing the US population, and also having this mentality as potentially a case study for other countries also who are facing way more significant population declines than the US is? How do you view, like, what are the other key opportunities we haven't touched on yet, and what can be learned for the broader world?
Well, so I mean, all across the developed world, we need to take parenting and family life more seriously as a real economic obstacle. And when I see some people, typically it'll be just like right wingers will take this seriously. So, like in Hungary, they'll say, "Okay, we need to help people have more children," but it's a conservative government, so they don't like actually want to spend money on anything. So they do these kind of gimmicky stuff, and then it doesn't work, and then they say, "Oh, it didn't work." It's big, it's expensive. It is creating a social welfare state that supports families and children is going to be on a par with having pension programs for the elderly, which is like a huge gargantuan undertaking. But it's done at a certain point because we decide it's important that people can have sort of dignified retirements in life. And if we think it's important for our it's important for people to have families and for our societies to kind of continue. In America, I think we have a tremendous immigration opportunity. I don't want to say that other countries don't have that opportunity, but if somebody comes to me from, I don't know, from Finland, and they say, "Well, it's Finland. This should be a land for Finns. I don't want a lot of people who aren't Finns moving here." I don't know. I mean, maybe they're right. Finnish people can have that argument. It's not for me to say what other countries should do about their national identities. But America is not like that, right? This is not, Ameriland. This is just, it's named after some Italian guy who drew a map somewhere, and somebody got confused about the naming. It's dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal. And we have the ability as the United States of America to be in touch with those founding values, those founding principles, to be proud of them, to be, critical about our history, but also insistent that that is the true Americanism, and that people who find that appealing, who want to come to a land of opportunity, who want to come to a place where lots of us have weird last names that people look at that to say YGL, like what what does that mean? And I don't even know, right? But that's who we are, and it really makes me sad that we've gotten to this very sort of narrow-minded spot in the name of nationalism, which to me, I mean, it sounds no offense, but like a political concept from Europe, right? I hear from Trump all the time. And like, that's just not what America is. It's not what Americanism is. So, family policy stuff that's in the book, zoning, land use type stuff, I think is very broadly applicable. Immigration is different because different countries have their different roles in the world. But I think we have our role and we should live up to it.
All right, thank you very much, Matt. I'm going to switch gears now to audience Q&A. For everybody participating live here, any questions you might have, please share them with us in the Q&A box in the next 2-3 minutes, and we'll do our very best to get through as many as possible. Matt, kicking off here with the first question from Tom Seaman, who says, one of the main issues in China and India is the management of such a large population. China clearly feels this. I've worked there. Do you really feel that we should take our country to a risky level that we could never reverse? I think countries like Australia and Canada actually have many advantages.
Well, do they have many advantages? I mean, these are fine countries, right? But like, I know a lot of people from Australia and Canada because what really smart and ambitious Canadian and Australian people do is they move to New York or to London or to San Francisco, maybe to Washington, because they want to make it in the big time, right? Like they want to come to big, like it's hard to build like a great company in New Zealand, right? And it's not because of anything wrong with New Zealand. Like they've got a great political system there. I really admire their constitution. Their prime minister seems a lot smarter than our head of government. But it's like, what are you going to do? It's New Zealand. America has incredible advantages in terms of the possibility of achieving really big things here, whether that's, in the movie industry or in the business world or in media or anything else that you want to do. And I actually think we should take that more seriously than we do. It's something that we take for granted. I mean, the Chinese, they try to quote unquote manage it's an authoritarian dictatorship. But we know, like, you can have small countries that also have that mentality. They're not, really big on freedom in Myanmar. The fact that it's small has not, changed that kind of impulse on the part of the government. So yeah, I mean, I basically just reject that idea.
Thank you, Matt. Next question is from Olivia Tosik, who asks, do you see population growth and expansion to emptier parts of the country potentially accelerating or decelerating voting reform, specifically thinking of the electoral college?
Yeah, I would not make this like my number one reason, but the US political system is geographically based. And we have right now very geographically unbalanced growth in which the country as a whole is growing very, very, very slowly. A handful of big Sunbelt metro areas are growing fast, mostly in Texas, Arizona, to an extent, Nashville, Atlanta. So we have I would think more in terms of the Senate than the Electoral College, but like Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, like all those like big square states, they're incredibly overrepresented in our political system, and they are becoming more overrepresented over time, right? If we were seeing convergence, I think those kind of disproportionalities would not be so bothersome. But what's actually happening is those empty rural states, especially the colder ones, are becoming older and diversity is not really increasing. And it's a real problem for the kind of stability and cohesion of the country. So coming up with things that kind of, get more people into those places and that help revitalize some of the quote unquote Rust Belt areas, I think does help with some of the political imbalances.
Thank you, Matt. Next question is as follows. Is the degrowth movement working against the kinds of policies you'd want to see, or are you just choosing a different narrative?
Yeah, I think the degrowth movement is wrong. It's bad. We should grow. Growth is good.
Just elaborate for like a few more seconds, Matt, so that just what might be obvious might not be so obvious.
Okay, well, so degrowth is this idea that I think, I work in the world of ideas and takes, hot takes on the internet, and degrowth is a thing you can say, right? You can sort of be, okay, well, we could just not have any environmental problems if every wealthy country decided that it would just settle for the living standards of Algeria, and we'll just sort of converge downward, and like that would be fairer and it wouldn't be so taxing. um but like, I don't think that has any meaning in the real world. Nobody who's actually in charge of policy in democratic countries, nobody's going to do that. And I think that spending your time wallowing in that kind of intellectual dead end is not going to help you. I don't agree with everything that the Green New Deal people say. um, some of their specific ideas are wrong, some of their big narratives are wrong, but the concept, right, which is that like we are going to achieve sustainability through investment and renewal and growth, I think is correct, right? So you know Elon Musk has made electric cars that appeal to the mass market, and we need versions of that for seasonal electrical storage. We need breakthroughs for concrete and cement manufacturing. Like we need to come up with ways to do these things and actually solve the problems, not kind of sit around and say like, well, if we just decided we don't care, then because no, like we don't, we won't. And there's certainly, you go to Vietnam, you go to Kenya, you go to Nigeria, you go to India, you go to Bangladesh, like those countries aren't embracing degrowth. Like they, people want electricity and all this good stuff in life.
All righty, thank you, Matt. Next one from Hugo Naley. He asks, if the only possible road to be rich and powerful is overpopulation, then why not 2, 3, or even 7 billion Americans?
Oh, you got to be realistic, Hugo. I mean, no, I mean, look, I think in the long term, right? If we had 2 billion Americans, we'd be on a par with German population density. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't know how you'd get from here to there. There's only like, I love immigration, and many people would like to move to the United States, but it's a finite number of people. I would like us to support people having larger families. And I think that's possible based on their stated desires, but there's also limits to it, right? Like we could have more people having 3 kids and more people going from 1 to 2, but people aren't going to go back to having 7 children. Like we're not going to become an agricultural society. People aren't going to just move here en masse from Munich. There's just, there's limits to what makes sense. But to me, it's not that like, well, we'll be grossly overpopulated at 2 billion. It's just that the aspiration is not realistic.
All right, thank you, Matt. Next one is as follows. What would be the fate of already incredibly dense cities with competitive real estate like New York? Would it get even harder to live there?
Well, no, it would be easier to live there, right? That's the point. It's hard to live in New York because there's tremendous demand for living in New York, and people are fighting for a constrained supply of real estate. We should make it easier to build more things in more parts of the city. I also, if I like transportation policy, so there's some stuff in there about the commuter rail and other things you could do to improve the transportation. But the whole idea is to make it easier. And now an interesting question is, at what point does New York become so dense that people stop wanting to live there? I think the experience of Tokyo is that we don't know where that answer is, because even though Japan's population is actually shrinking, Tokyo keeps growing. They have very good land use policy in Japan. So if more people want to live in Tokyo, they keep building more apartments for them, and people keep wanting to go. I mean, it's an empirical question though, right? Like, I don't think we should make people move to New York if they, rather live in Richmond or something. It's just the evidence is that not everyone, but many people like these really big, dense cities, because you get so many options. There's a lot to do in New York. I mean, it sounds dumb to even say it, but like there's just a lot of benefits to large dense cities.
Thank you, Matt. Next one from Dan Carlton. He asks, are you a proponent of one or more new significant American political party?
Sort of. I think it would be good to have a proportional electoral system, which I think would have the consequence of leading to more political parties. I think in the institutional setup that we have, creating new parties is probably not going to have the benefits that people would want, but that if we should change our institutions anyway, to reduce, this is a little off topic, but it's like, there are more Republicans in LA County than there are in West Virginia, right? But Republicans who live in LA County have no representation in Congress, right? So the idea of Los Angeles-ness or New York City-ness exists in Congress right now only as a Democratic Party idea. So Republicans have no incentive to actually care about the fates of these places. Donald Trump will just disparage them, say, oh, it's blue cities, they're ridden with crime. And also Republicans they don't say, look, as the free market party, we have free market ideas that are good for cities, right? A proportional system will fix that. Like, you will have Democrats from the plains and Republicans from the big coastal cities and help separate ideological and geographical polarization. It will also open the door for more political parties, right? For niche parties, for a small, innovation-minded party, for probably some like crazy fascists who I would find deplorable party as well. But just like more things could happen. It's weird to have, forgetting a billion, for a country of 330 million people, to try to squeeze everybody into two different political parties is like inherently awkward and uncomfortable.
Thank you very much, Matt. One additional question is, do you see dense living as at all antithetical to the big yard, big house culture of America? Or is there really enough land to keep that lifestyle for the many people who want it?
Yes, I mean, there's nothing wrong with people wanting big houses and big yards. The oddity of America is that we make houses with yards mandatory. And then if we ask, why have we done that? We give the answer, well, that's because that's what people want. So, the example I give in my book is like toasters, right? Most people have a toaster, as far as I can tell. And we could say like, well, Americans, we love our toast, because why not? Like, it's a useful thing to have. But you don't have to have one, right? Like, if you want to save some counter space, you don't have to buy one. If you don't have the money, you don't have to buy one. And if someone were to suggest, okay, well, we're going to make toaster ownership mandatory, and then I would say, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Is everybody going to yell at me and they'd be like, well, you don't understand. Like, people really like toasting their bread. But like, that's fine. Like, if you want a house with a yard, get a house with a yard. But why is it that you're not allowed to build a house without a yard in so many places? Like me, I live in the city, and it is mandatory for me to have both a small backyard and a small front yard. Now, I like my backyard, to be perfectly honest, but I don't need the second crappy little yard. Like what's it even for? I'd like more space. Other people might just like a small studio to live in. So, in let me give formal treatment of this. There are trade-offs between commuting distance, home size, outdoor space, price, all these kinds of things. And free markets are very flawed. There are all kinds of things that an unregulated marketplace does not do correctly. The one thing that it really does do correctly, though, is let consumers balance a complicated set of trade-offs about what it is they want. Right? Like parking spaces, lawns, commutes, like that's what a market is for. And we should be using market mechanisms there. And we should be focusing our regulatory efforts on pollution and the stability of the financial system and providing for the needy and stuff like that.
Thank you so much, Matt. So what I'd love to ask you to do just in a couple minutes is, if you were somebody that wanted to really, kind of get this to be like, take all the concepts in your book and make it real, okay? Mm-hmm. And somebody, let's say, adopted your work and said, I want to make this happen. What would be, and let's say you were just voicing that person for the time being, what would you say to Democrats, what would you say to Republicans to kind of convince them that this is the right thing to do? You obviously gave us a lot of the ingredients throughout this conversation, but just like what would be our elevator pitch, I guess, to both sides, given their unique kind of potential rejections of some of these
So
ideas?
I challenge everybody, like, so you don't need to agree with this book. You don't need to agree with these ideas. But what are you saying you disagree with, right? Are you up on Capitol Hill, Senator X, Congressman X, are you saying we should learn to live as number two? Are you saying we have some way to have quadruple the per capita GDP of China? Because I don't see anybody saying that. And so if you agree with me that we should stay for number one, if you agree with me that population matters, then we're having a good conversation, and we can talk about, well, okay, should we support families with daycare centers, or should we give them vouchers, or how do we incorporate stay-at-home moms? I mean, it's politics, right? Like, people have disagreements about values, people have different ideas. We find compromises, and we do things if we have goals that we agree on. And I feel that we can agree on these goals, that I am not seeing people out there saying, well, what are you talking about? Succeed in geopolitical competition. Like, let's just give up. Let's just say Xi Jinping, he's got it all figured out. So that's my answer. Is like, I am trying to give an answer to an important question, and I don't expect everybody to agree with my answer. But I see a lot of people right now not even engaging with the question.
Well, thank you, Matt, for getting us to engage with the question. I think zooming out the way you just did to share with us, like, bigger picture, do you want to have be number one or not? And if so, then what's the way to get there without quadrupling GDP per capita and so forth? So thank you for that very final question to take us home and help us wrap this great conversation. Please share with us how our community can best support your work and best engage with you going forward. And if you have one final call to action or word of wisdom for us, we'd love to hear that as well.
Well, the publishers, they watch all this stuff. So I just got to say, it's like, really buying the book is very important. The most important thing. Look, I think, as I was saying, I would like to see politicians answer this question. And that means I would like to see more people in the community, engaged citizens, business leaders, ask the question, like, what are we doing here? Right, as a country, because you've got your critique of the other side and whatever else, but like, what's the plan, Senator? Like, what do you think we should do?
Very well said. Matt, thank you so much for all the great work that you do. Thank you for crystallizing your thoughts in this book and also in the 60 minutes that we had together. Really appreciate you being here, and excited to see how you build out on these ideas.
Thank you.
All right. See you again very soon, and happy Friday to everybody. See you all again soon. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
All right.